talking about the causes of the Great Depression, what life kind of looks like during it today. So I'll just go ahead and get started. All right, so the economic collapse that began in 1929 really seemed kind of unimaginable just months before it had happened. In the 1928 election, both presidential candidates painted a very rosy picture of the future, with Republican presidential nominee Herbert Hoover declaring that we are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. So for the presidential election of 1928, the Democrats chose Alfred E. Smith, governor of New York. Smith was the first Roman Catholic to win a major party's presidential nomination, and he faced a tough challenger as Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce and former head of the Food Administration. Smith's religious beliefs became a campaign issue, as some Protestants claimed that the Catholic Church financed Smith's campaign and would have inappropriate influence on American politics. The attacks embarrassed Hoover, a Quaker, and he tried to quash them as quickly as possible. But the charges damaged Smith's candidacy. The prosperity of the 1920s, for which the Republicans took full credit, was a bigger challenge to Smith's candidacy. Hoover ends up winning in a landslide. On March 4th, 1929, an estimated 50,000 onlookers stood in the rain to listen to Hoover's inaugural address. So basically, what we're seeing at this time, before 1929 hits, is the United States is doing pretty well. They had benefited quite handily from being the kind of European bank for World War I. Wartime production had kind of changed things industrially. Things seem to be going very well. The stock market is making a lot of people seemingly fabulously wealthy at this particular point. So things seem like they are going very, very well. There's old Herbert Hoover there. All right, so this optimism that swept Hoover into office also drove stock prices to new highs. So sometimes the stock market has a long period of rising stock prices, or what is called a bull market. The bull market of the 1920s convinced many to invest in stocks. By 1929, approximately 10% of American households owned stocks. So before the late 1920s, stocks generally reflected their true values. But in the late 1920s, however, many investors failed to consider a company's earnings and profits, and buyers engaged in speculation or betting the market would continue to climb, thus enabling them to sell stock and make money quickly. All right, so the market's going up, uppity up. All right, everyone's saying, I want in on that. They buy, they sell, they make small fortunes. Why not get richer if you've already made some money off of it? Buy more, sell more, right? So it's a process that is kind of recurring for some people. Now, other people, right, that are in this 10% that we're talking about are going to have to buy stocks on margin, right? Making only a small cash down payment as low as 10% of the price. So with an investment of about $1,000, an investor could buy a sum of stocks worth 10 grand. So the remaining 9,000 came as an interest-bearing loan from the stockbroker, and quick profits were possible as stock prices kept rising, but problems came if the prices began to fall. So to protect a loan, a broker could issue a margin call demanding the investor repay the loan at once. Okay, so basically you have invested, right? Let's just say this is us. We've invested $1,000, right, into this. We've borrowed $9,000, right, to invest into the stock market. So we have a total of 10 grand. We're out $1,000 of our own money, no matter what, right? And then we're out $9,000 of someone else's money. If things are going well, right, and say you have doubled that, right, amount, so now you've paid back the loan, right? You've made back your initial investment and then some, right? You're profiting. That's great. That's tremendous, right? And that is going to happen for a little while. Okay, people are going to make money off of this. The stock market continues to climb. People continue to borrow more money or invest more of their own money, depending on which group you're kind of falling into. And things seem really great, right? Maybe you've invested $10,000 and you're up 60 or 70 grand. Here's the problem with the stock market, right? You can make money really fast, and you can lose money just as fast, right? So if you've invested that $1,000 of your own money, borrowed the $9,000, all right, stock market, it's going up, 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 up. Maybe you've got a total of $25,000. You're like, okay, you know what? I don't have enough to buy all that I want, but if I do this a couple more times here and there, then the stockbroker will, forward me X amount of money. So if you put down $20,000 now as a loan, they're going to give you $50,000. So you have $30,000. So you're in the hole technically until that makes a profit. Well, here's the problem: the stock market starts to go down, and it doesn't just go down; it goes way down. Right? That broker is going to issue that margin call. All right? Now you've made a few $1,000s profit, but you reinvested that profit and then borrowed more money. So now you're out the money that you've lost that was yours, and the stockbroker wants you to pay back that $30,000 today. Okay? So you are up a creek without a paddle. You're not even in a boat at this point. You're just kind of screwed. All right? And this doesn't just happen to one or two people. It happens to thousands. All right? So that's where we're heading. That optimism that sweeps Hoover in is tremendous. It's great. Everything looks amazing. Okay? But it doesn't take very much to change that. So sometimes the stock market has a long period of rising stock prices or a blank market. What kind of market is that? Whenever it just goes up, 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 up. It's an animal with horns. Bull. Yep, bull market. All right, so on October 21st, 1929, the comedian Groucho Marx was awakened by a telephone call from his broker. He says, "You'd better get down here with some cash to cover your margin," the broker says. The stock market had plunged, right? So plunged, not just dropped a little bit, not a few points, not a couple of percent. It has taken a nosedive, right? The dazed comedian had to pay back the money he had borrowed to buy stocks, which were now selling for far less than what he had paid for them. Other brokers made similar margin calls, and customers put stocks up for sale at a frenzied pace, driving the market into a tailspin. On October 24th, a day that came to be called Black Thursday, the market plummeted even further. Marx was entirely wiped out. His earnings from plays and films were gone, and he was deeply in debt. The following week, on October 29th, the day that was later called Black Tuesday, prices took the steepest dive yet. That day, more than 16 million shares of stock were sold, and the value of the industrial index, a measure of the value of leading industrial companies, dropped by 10%. By mid-November, the market price of stocks had dropped by more than a third, and some $30 billion had been lost, a sum roughly equal to the total wages that Americans earned in 1929. Although the stock market crash was not the only major cause of the Depression, it undermined the economy's ability to overcome other weaknesses. Right? So, the stock market is 100%, if you, in the future, are involved in the stock market, just know it is full and just rife with risk. Right? There is no guarantee that you are going to make money, a ton of money. You may make a little money, or you may lose some money here or there, but there's just no guarantee with it. All right, it's all really a lot of guesswork in some ways. But anyway, so the big thing here to note is that a lot of economists believe that if people hadn't panicked, and that's what people do, they panic, right? If they hadn't panicked quite so much, maybe this the stock market wouldn't have crashed quite as hard as what it did, and it might have been a little bit easier of an economic recovery. Who knows? What we do know is that people did panic. They started selling off stocks like crazy. Prices went through the floor, and everything just kept adding on to itself, kind of like that snowball rolling down the hill type effect there, right? Literally to the point where people were selling their brand new cars for $100 because they'd lost everything in the stock market. All right, so the market crash weakened the nation's banks in two ways. Okay, so first, by 1929, banks had lent billions of dollars to stock speculators. Okay, so it wasn't just brokers; there's banks doing this as well. Second, many banks had invested depositors' money in the stock market. So you know that interest that you get in your savings account and stuff. That's where that's going to come from. Money just doesn't grow other money by planting it, in the garden or whatever. So. Anyway, whenever these stock values collapsed, banks lost money on their investments and speculators defaulted on their loans. All right. So not only did they take the money that they had to invest, lost it, they also weren't getting the money back from the people who had borrowed money to invest in the stock market. So they're kind of getting hit twice as hard. So having suffered serious losses, many of the banks cut back drastically on loans. With less credit available, consumers and businesses were not able to borrow as much money, sending the economy into a recession. Some banks could not absorb the losses they suffered and just had to close. The government did not insure bank deposits, so if a bank failed, customers, including those who did not invest in the stock market, simply lost their savings. Right? As a growing number of banks closed in 1929 and 1930, a severe crisis of confidence in the banking system went to further destabilize the economy. News of bank failures worried Americans, and some depositors made runs on banks, thus causing the banks to fail. A bank run takes place whenever many depositors decide to withdraw their money at the same time, usually out of fear that the banks will collapse. Most banks make a profit by lending money received from depositors and collecting interest on those loans. The bank keeps only a fraction of depositors' money in reserve. Usually that reserve is enough to meet the bank's needs. If too many people withdraw that money, however, the bank can and will collapse in most cases. But in 1932, about 1 in 4 banks in the United States had gone out of business. Okay, so basically, the way that works is really simple, right? So, the bank may have $500,000 in cash on hand. As soon as that hits, what can the bank do anything? There's no more money to give out. What do you do? Write an IOU? So it's not people panicking once again and making that run to the bank causes a lot of these places to close. Not saying that it would have been tremendously better if people had approached things in a little bit more calm, like let's wait to panic until everything is truly 100% the worst it could possibly be. People just, boom, panicked. And this is what it looks like. Okay? I mean, we have people just trying to get into the banks to get their life savings out, right? And that's the thing. People aren't taking a couple $100. It's like, I better, get some cash to make it through the next few weeks or whatever. They're taking everything. So you have $500,000 cash on hand, and you have, 6,000 customers, and everybody's coming in trying to take out $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $10,000, $20,000, whatever they have to have in savings or checking or whatever. That's not going to go very far, right? So a blank takes place when many depositors decide to withdraw their money at the same time, usually out of fear that the bank is going to collapse. What do we call that? Call it a bank. Bank run. That's right. All right. So overproduction was a factor leading to the onset of the Great Depression. More efficient machinery increased the production capacity of factories and farms, and most Americans didn't earn enough to buy up the goods that they were helping to produce these massive numbers of. Manufacturing output per person hour rose 32%, but average workers' wages only increased about 8%. In 1929, the top 5% of all American households earned 30% of the nation's total income. In contrast, about two-thirds of families earn less than $2,500 a year, leaving them with little disposable income. And yes, I know, that does not seem like very much. That's the equivalent today of probably like around $30,000 a year, something right there. It's pretty close to what would be considered the poverty line for a family of four. Anyway, so farmers in particular did not share in the prosperity of the 1920s, as many had gone into debt to buy land or equipment during World War I when demand for their product was really high. So when prices fell, they tried to produce even more to pay their debts, taxes, and living expenses. Prices dropped so low that farmers went bankrupt and lost their farms. During the 1920s, many Americans had purchased high-cost items like refrigerators and cars on the installment plan. Purchasers could make some small down payments and then pay the remainder of that item's price in monthly installments, but paying off such debts eventually forced some buyers to stop making new purchases. Because of the decrease in demand for their products, manufacturers in turn cut production and laid off employees. So the slowdown in retail sales reverberated throughout the economy. When radio sales slumped, for example, orders for things like copper wire, wood cabinets, and glass radio tubes slowed down as well. Montana copper mines, Minnesota lumberjacks, and Ohio glassworkers would lose their jobs as well. Jobless workers cut purchases, further reducing the sales and compounding the problem. This put even more Americans out of work, and unemployment insurance was non-existent. Many families had little or no savings, all right, and even if they did, chances were their bank was closed. All right, you had a 1 in 4 shot that your bank was probably closed. So, lost jobs often meant dire circumstances, and in 1930 alone, about 26,000 businesses failed throughout the United States. Many jobs might have been saved if American manufacturers had sold more goods abroad, but as the bull market of the 1920s sped up, however, U.S. banks made loans to speculators rather than loans to foreign companies. So loans from U.S. banks had helped European nations make war reparations and pay down war debts. They had also secured foreign markets for U.S. exports. Without these loans from U.S. banks, foreign companies purchased fewer American products. In 1929, Hoover wanted to encourage overseas trade by lowering tariffs. Congress, however, decided to protect American industry from foreign competition by raising tariffs. The resulting legislation, the Hawley-Smoot tariff, raised the average tariff rate to the highest level in American history. In the end, it failed to help American businesses because foreign countries responded by raising their own tariffs. This meant fewer American products were sold overseas, and by 1932, exports had fallen to less than half the level that they had been in 1929, and a decrease in exports hurt both American companies and farmers. So, just as consumers were able to buy more goods on credit, access to easy money propelled the stock market. Instead of raising interest rates to curb excessive speculation, the Federal Reserve Board kept its rates low throughout the 1920s. The board's failure to raise interest rates did significantly help cause the Depression in two ways. First, by keeping those rates low, the board encouraged member banks to make risky loans. Second, the low interest rates led business leaders to think that the economy was still expanding. As a result, they borrowed more money to expand production. This was a serious mistake because it led to overproduction when sales were falling. When the Depression finally hit, companies had to lay off workers to cut costs. Then the Federal Reserve made another mistake. It raised the interest rates, thus tightening credit, and the economy continued to spiral down. All right, so the blink raised the average tariff rate to the highest level in American history. What goes there? What tariff act goes there? Starts with an S. Yeah, the Holly Smooth and Smooth Holly tariff. Either one works there. All right, so the jobless often went hungry. Whenever possible, they stood in bread lines for free food and lined up outside idle soup kitchens set up by private groups. People could not pay their rent or mortgage, lost their homes. Some, paralyzed by fear and humiliation, did not move and were evicted. Court officers called bailiffs ejected them and their belongings. Throughout the country, newly homeless people put up shacks in unused or public lands. They built shanty towns, which they called Hoovervilles, after the president they blamed for their plight. In search of work or a better life, many homeless, unemployed Americans began walking, hitchhiking, or most often riding the rails across the country. These wanderers were called hobos and would sneak past railroad police to slip into open boxcars on freight trains. Hundreds of thousands of people, mostly boys and young men, wander from place to place in this way. As the Depression also caused many immigrants to return to their native countries. In some cases, this repatriation was voluntary as jobs became scarce. In other cases, repatriation was forced, and the federal government launched repeat ration drives to send poor immigrants back to their home countries. It also stepped up efforts to deport immigrants who had violated the law. In the Southwest, federal officials rounded up Mexicans, often without regard to their citizenship tattoos, and forcibly returned them to Mexico. All right, so when crop prices dropped in the 1920s, farmers tried to make up the difference by planting more wheat. Then a terrible drought struck the Great Plains, leaving the fields bare. The soil dried to dust, and a vast so-called dust bowl stretched from the Dakotas to Texas. Winds blew the arid earth aloft, blanketing the sky for hundreds of miles. Dust buried crops and livestock. Humans and animals caught outdoors sometimes died of suffocation when the dust filled their lungs. During most of the 1930s, an average of 50 dust storms a year were hitting the plains. Some Great Plains farmers managed to hold on to their land, but others were not as lucky. If their land was mortgaged, they had to turn the property over to the banks. Then, nearly penniless, many families headed west, hoping for a better life in California. Because many immigrants were from Oklahoma, they became known as Okies. So, image from one of the dust storms there. All right. So, the hard times of the 1930s led many Americans to want to escape their worries as movies and radio programs grew increasingly popular. During the 1930s, more than 60 million Americans went to the movies each week. Child stars delighted viewers, and comedies provided a relief from their daily worries. The Marx Brothers amused audiences at such films as Animal Crackers. Moviegoers also loved cartoons, Walt Disney produced the first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, in 1937. Serious films often celebrated ordinary people and the values of small-town America. In Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart played a decent but naive senator. He refused to compromise his principles and exposes the corruption of some of his colleagues. In 1939, MGM produced The Wizard of Oz, a colorful musical that lifted viewers' spirits. That same year, Vivien Leigh and Clark Gable thrilled audiences in Gone with the Wind. And frankly, my dear. But anyway, so a Civil War epic that won 9 Academy Awards. Hattie McDaniel won Best Supporting Actress, becoming the first African American to win an Academy Award. While movies captured the imagination, radio offered info and entertainment. As tens of millions of Americans listened to the radio daily, comedians such as Jack Benny were popular, as were the adventures of superheroes such as the Green Hornet. Daytime dramas continued their storylines from day to day. Programs like The Guiding Light presented these personal struggles of middle-class families. The sponsors were often makers of laundry soaps, so the shows were nicknamed soap operas. Okay, so that's where that term comes from. Radio also exposed listeners to a variety of musical styles. Americans enjoyed hit songs from movies and Broadway musicals to swing the homeless, to swing music to country. Literature and the visual arts flourished during the 1930s as writers and artists tried to portray life around them using the homeless and unemployed as their subjects in stories and pictures. Novelists developed new writing techniques, and The Sound and the Fury, William Faulkner, shows that characters are what characters are thinking and feeling before they speak. Using this stream of consciousness technique, he exposes hidden attitudes of residents of fictional Mississippi County. Images were also becoming more influential as photographers roamed the nation with their new 35mm cameras, seeking new subjects. In 1936, Time magazine publisher Henry Lucy introduced Life magazine, a weekly photojournalism magazine that enjoyed instant success. The striking pictures of photojournalist Dorothea Lange and Margaret Bourke-White showed how the Great Depression affected the average Americans. Painters of the 1930s included Thomas Hart Benton and Grant Ward, whose styles were referred to as the Regionalist School, and their work emphasized traditional American values, especially those of the rural Midwest and South. Wood's best-known painting today is American Gothic. The portrait pays tribute to no-nonsense Midwesterners who, while gently making fun of their severity. Right? Get into later. All right. That is where we're going to stop at for today.